Ecotechnology is a community environmental nonprofit. We have 2 offices, one in Pittsfield, Mass. And one in Florence, Mass. And our slogan is, we make green make sense. We help people go about their lives with less environmental impact. We also have a really great recycled home goods sort of building store in Springfield, Mass. on 83 Warwick Street. It's called Eco Building Bargains, and it's on 83 Warwick Street. It's a really neat place. It's got everything from recycled floors to doors. And we also have rain barrels up there. We have compost bins there for sale, and smaller kitchen tubs too. This workshop is brought to you by a grant from the USDA Rural Development Association. And we have some display materials up from the DEP, along with a compost bin that you can buy here from me right now for $25 from the DEP. This is recycled plastic, and it's a large unit with a top on it, so you can buy that here. We also have a worm bin that we can look at. Today we're going to look at why composting is important, how we can compost, what we can compost, some good recipes and ratios that make the best compost, and where we can have the compost. And at the end of this short presentation, we're going to go sort of in the back greenhouse there, where we can actually build a compost pile together. Compost is actually one of the oldest forms of recycling, and it's happening naturally on your lawns. And what this process is, we're talking about aerobic composting, and we're talking about speeding up the process a little bit so that it happens at a faster rate, but it's still in a natural state. Let's see. Why is composting important?
Reduces waste.
Reduces
Going
waste.
to the landfill and, maybe mixing in what could degrade with things that can't degrade is not good.
Great. Great. It reduces trips to the landfills.
Filled with nutrients.
Filled with nutrients. Okay, great. Any other things about why we can compost? Does anyone have fun composting?
Yes. Yeah.
Nice. How many people out there actually compost right now? Great.
Do you count piling leaves on top of each other?
Sure. That sounds good.
You do get black over.
Yeah?
A little bit.
Great. Yeah, so compost has a lot of natural benefits. In addition to creating less trips to the landfills, it creates less methane that's actually going up into the atmosphere. Methane, which is produced by trash or organic matter that's produced in landfill, is actually 20% more powerful as a greenhouse gas. And so by composting, we reduce the methane content. Do you know some other things of why we want to compost, Carl?
Well, compost itself is just really nutritious and a good medium to grow your plants in. First of all, it has a great water retention value. So if you have a very sandy soil and you have trouble retaining water, add some compost, and that organic material grabs that water and holds it in the soil instead of letting it run through. It has a very complex mix of organic materials that go into it, so it has a complex mix of nutrients that come out, and these nutrients are slow released versus a chemical fertilizer where you can actually burn your plant's roots. You can't burn your roots with a compost. Those nutrients are slowly coming out throughout the year as your plant needs it. So.
Yep. And another thing is, if you pay for your trash to be disposed of, and you're putting in compostable things in your trash, you're paying for your trash to be removed. About 30% of what's in your landfill can actually be composted. So you think about all that waste that can be composted and what that can reduce in the landfills. It's pretty substantial. Do we live in a pay-as-you-throw neighborhood in this area? Do you buy the bags where you throw the trash?
Yep.
So therefore, again, if you're paying for less waste that you're filling up these bags, you're not paying for as much that's being transported to the landfills or to the transfer station, and that's going in your landfills.
So, as the composting alchemist had mentioned before, it can be a pretty complex process behind what actually happens when you make compost. As you can see, there's many different tiers of organisms. You're starting with your organic residues, which is the basic food supply of the whole system. Then you have a whole food web of organisms that come in. There's the molds, bacteria, acetomites, and then small insects that prey upon them, and then larger ones to create a whole food web happening within your compost bin. However, you don't need to be an alchemist to make this food web happen. All you need to do is put a scoop or two of good compost or soil into your compost bin, and all the organisms you need will come from that.
I heard something like there's 1 million microbes in a tablespoon of good compost or good topsoil. So you think about adding that into your compost, they're just going to thrive in that compost. So what do those organisms need to survive? What do humans, what do animals need to survive? Water, oxygen, carbon, okay, that's a building block.
Anything else?
Warmth, food, oxygen, those are great things. I think we've got 3 of 4.
Nitrogen.
Nitrogen, okay, that's in there.
Sunlight.
Sunlight, good. I'm looking for one more. Kind of protects us. Shelter, right. It's your home. And so that's what all compost systems should have. They should have some sort of structure to them. They should have some sort of oxygen, food source, and water source. Things like sunlight definitely help in the winter time. Nitrogen, carbon, they pick that up through the materials that you deposit in your compost bin. So with the structure, you can have a couple different, there's a lot of different structures for compost bins out there. You can have open systems where they're just a pile of compost. However, if you want to sort of keep that away from rodents and mice and things, it helps to keep them contained. It also helps generate that heat that's involved in the process of breaking things down. So those microbes thrive in an area where the temperature is anywhere from 100 degrees to 160 degrees. So your compost bin, you might have a thermometer or a probe thermometer that you can stick in the center of your compost, and it should be about 140 degrees, because that's how you know those organisms are eating and living and breathing and digesting that material, that organic waste.
So to maintain that sort of temperature, it's important to keep an eye on what's going into your pile and also the size of your pile. A good pile should be about 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. So those 3 dimensions. You shouldn't go too much above that size, or else there will be too much compaction from its weight. And anything below that, it might not have enough mass to it to hold onto and build up a lot of heat to get to a nice hot temperature. But composting will still happen outside of that kind of perfect median.
Yep. It might be at a slower rate. What about water? How much water should we have in a compost bin?
Enough to keep it moist but not drenched.
Right, exactly. It should be like the substance of a wrung-out sponge. If you squeeze that sponge kind of tight, if you squeeze a handful of compost, it should maybe drip out a couple drops, but relatively it should be fairly dry. And then the food, the perfect balance of nitrogen-rich foods and carbon-rich foods. And when we think about nitrogen foods, we're going to talk about green foods. And we're talking about carbon foods, we're going to talk about brown materials. So I've got a couple things up here to illustrate that. I've had some compost collected from my kitchen, and just these materials, this is going to be green material. These are your kitchen scraps. These are high in nitrogen. So you have banana peels, onions, some citrus things, some eggshells in here, And I have coffee grounds in here. I put my coffee filters in there. And it's a little wet, which is fine because then I add my browns, which are dead leaves and some other things that we're going to talk about too. But when we're talking about browns and greens, we're talking about browns being carbon-rich materials and greens being nitrogen-rich material. So the browns are sort of the building blocks, the greens provide the nucleic acids and the more of the cell growth properties for these organisms to survive.
So with that, we're going to kind of move on to our to compost or not to compost. That is the question section. And we're just going to kind of ask you guys to help us figure out a list of green materials and brown materials that are great to put in your compost pile. So anyone have an idea of what a good green material would be?
Lettuce.
Lettuce, okay. So as Eric had just shown before, food scraps are all great to put in there. Well, not all great. We'll get into a few that aren't so great in a minute.
And things like eggshells, if you want it completely rodent-proof, you want to rinse those out. Eggshells don't break down completely. They're more like a sand or like a gravel in your compost where they'll really help aerate the soils.
So does anyone else have any other ideas they want to shout out?
Cut grass.
Cut grass?
Yep.
That's another great one.
Ash from the fireplace.
Yep. Now, which column do you think that should go into? Browns. Okay. Now, the thing about ash from your fireplace is that carbon in that gets burned off. So it comes out in CO2, so what's left is very high in nitrogen, so it's actually a green compost material, counter to what you think. Yep.
I was just testing you all.
Under brown, leaves.
Yep.
Leaves.
Oh,
You got the brown side, Mr. Eric Brown.
one over here.
Could I ask a question about the wood ash? If you're burning pellets in a pellet stove, do you have to be concerned about blues or anything in the
I'm not sure what kind of additives are in that.
That's what I researched this last week, actually. And there's pellets that are made with somewhat of a product, and then there's the products that are just naturally occurring. The polymer that's binding those pellets together is actually a natural occurring substance in the wood. And so you just have to check in,
When you buy
look
it.
at your, the ingredients or where the pellets are made.
So
Because
if it says naturally
depends.
occurring polymer, you're good to go?
Yep,
Okay,
yep,
thank you.
because that's just an ash. What about some other greens or browns?
Plant waste.
I'm sorry?
Plant waste out of your garden.
Okay, plant waste, yep. Would those be greens or browns?
Brown.
Who says greens?
Green if they're fresh, brown if they're dry.
Perfect. Green if they're fresh, brown if they're dry. So plant waste, if they're dried up, they're going to have much more carbon to them. If they're fresh, they're going to have much more green nitrogen to them. So make sure when you're adding those things, make sure that they're not weeds that are going to seed. Make sure they're not invasive or vine plants that might crawl up into your compost.
So, yeah.
Do you compost pine needles?
Okay, so that's another thing that goes along with the ash in that it's a very acidic material, so you want to be careful with how much of that you're putting into your pile. You don't really want to have more than 10% pine needles, 10% wood ash, just because it could change the pH of the product. You can, however, make a more acidic compost for like strawberries and plants that really like to get acidic soils. So it's what you're looking for in an end product, but not too much, generally speaking.
And what compost is great for is it really balances out the pH. So the idea is to get a variety of different things into your compost because that variety is really going to balance out your soils. Yes.
Did you say not more than 10% of either wood ash or pine needles, or not more than 10% of both?
Well, the question was, should you not have more than 10% of pine needles and wood ash, or pine needles or wood ash, as in 20% of those materials? I'm not really sure on that, but like as a general rule of thumb, you don't want to overdo those things in your pile. I think they would have kind of a cumulative effect like that. So
10% would be safe, or 20% might be for acid-loving plants.
yeah, maybe. It's all about finding out like your own recipe from what materials you have and what objective you have in making compost.
You can also do sticks, if they're smaller sticks or if they're larger sticks. If they're larger, you can sort of slice into them a little bit, expose that surface area. You can safely run them over with a lawnmower to break them down a lot more. So those are some other brown materials too.
Just jumping back to the leaves, it might be a good idea to also run those over with a lawnmower, because the more you break down the material
It's just chopped
and
up
expand more surface area, the quicker the composting process can happen. Yep.
Where do corn cobs go? Are they green? They never break down.
They break down, but it's slow.
Yeah.
So they're another thing that you might notice if you threw in a corn cob into your compost, it'll come out in the end product as a corn cob. To kind of help that along, it'd be good to break it up as much as you can. So it's a brown material.
Question about
bag.
leaves.
Tea bags, yep, we can add those in the greens.
And you have live plants also on greens, right?
Live plants we can add to the greens, yeah.
Can you use shredded office paper as a substitute for leaves?
That's a great question. The question was, can you use shredded office paper? Depends on your compost system or who you sort of are. What I say is check to see what's in that paper. There's soy inks, but there's also a lot of metals that are in like processed papers. Newspapers aren't so bad. They're a looser fiber, and a lot of times they're processed with soy inks. But definitely look into what sort of paper you're adding, because it can be high in bleaches or chemicals or even metals. But on a small scale, it's definitely an okay source. If you're fine with that in your compost, it's a fine source of carbon, especially in the wintertime when there's piles and piles of snow covering your leaf piles. So.
Yeah, we had a question in the back.
Would you clarify about seeds, the problem of having seeds in your fresh leaves? You said something about not having too many seeds. Now, I read once that if you reach that high temperature of 140 degrees, that got rid of your seeds. Is that so, or is that something we should be aware of?
I mean, that is one way you can inoculate them if your pile is big enough to get that kind of thermal temperature that high. Another way you can kind of just make sure that they get scorched like that is you can lay them out on blacktop and just let them bake in the sun, and that should kill any seeds it has. Or you can put them in a black garbage bag and lay that out in the sun, so the black in the bag captures all that heat and brings up the temperature to kill everything in there.
Black or clear?
Black or clear too, because it has kind of a greenhouse effect. You just want to make sure in the composting process the temperature gets high enough to inoculate the seeds.
And those seeds are going to want to thrive in there. So once those seeds start going, they're going to draw those nutrients into that seed. So the idea is that you don't want to start growing something in your compost, because that's your compost that you're going to want to use on your soils or your starters or other seeds. What about sawdust? Do we want to use sawdust in our compost?
Yes.
Sure. Yes?
Now, which side is that? Yep.
What about pressure-treated sawdust?
No,
This group is good.
probably not too much sawdust.
Okay, so I'll get to two. You don't want too much sawdust in there because it will dry it out a lot. The other question was, do you want to keep soil in your compost? And soil is a good nutrient to bring in organisms. So every couple inches or maybe every foot, you could add another shovelful of soil or old compost to it, because that will bring in some more nutrients to help break down the...
You should add fertilizer too.
What type of fertilizer? Okay. There's thoughts on that, because what you're doing is putting things into your compost that might not naturally be occurring or upsetting the balance a little bit.
It hastens it.
I'm sorry?
It hastens it.
It hastens it? Okay.
Okay, so adding a commercial fertilizer like that might add more nitrogen to your compost, which will really speed up the process, because commercial fertilizers are generally NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So they have those three main elements in it, and nitrogen is what really drives the composting pile. If you have too much nitrogen in your pile, it'll make it heat up too much and you might get a foul smell, for instance. So by adding that fertilizer, you can kind of speed up and supercharge it. But I think you would have a similar effect if you kind of err on the side of high nitrogen materials that you're putting in.
Will
Just for-
commercial fertilizer kill worms, though? Does it,
That could be a problem with it, yeah.
What about lime?
Some people say you can lime a pile, but it's definitely not a necessary thing.
Yeah. Again, that's sort of adding to the balance that should naturally occur. If you're
It's swinging it one way or the other.
exactly.
Yeah.
If you're doing a compost bin correctly, you're going to have a great balance of your browns and greens, and that's going to give you what you need as far as reducing the smell and giving you the nutrients that you need for your topsoil or starters or planting trees and bushes. Okay.
How about horse manure with horse bedding in a large pile that you turn with a tractor?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're composting.
Yep. Yep. The idea there is just make sure there's air getting to it. So if it's horse manure, that's grass or grain, so that can be composted. Horse bedding, that can be composted. Just get some air into it. You might want to wear a mask when you're doing that. But what about pet wastes? Dog, cat?
No.
Right. We don't want to be doing that.
So, on that,
Why?
yeah.
Quick question about like paper towels and toilet paper and stuff. Again, would you just, what if it's like organic? I guess you
Those are brown materials.
Yep.
Some of them, for instance, might be chlorinated, however. So you get into more complex issues of putting stuff that might not naturally occur into a pile. But as long as it's a small amount of chlorination, like I don't think it'll slow down the process at all.
And those fibers are very wide, so they're going to break down fairly easily, and they're not something that you can recycle. So if you're able to add them to a small amount to your compost, they will break down.
That waste was the
Sorry. We had one question about pet waste. The reason that we don't want to add pet waste to the compost is because a lot of that is a meat product, and it will bring in organisms like E. coli that will destroy other organisms that are healthy for your compost system.
Is that also true of seashells?
I believe seashells, I haven't heard that with seashells, but I haven't been on this sort of coastal side where a lot of seashells are being used to...
We're coming from the west of Mass, not the east. So.
But I think they would simulate somewhat like eggshells, where they provide the aeration and material of breaking things down.
And that's putting in like the basic minerals of life in, like basic building block stuff, like calcium, the eggshells, and seafood shells.
Salt. ocean salts and stuff like that would be on the seashore.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much salt you'd want to put in because that could increase the salinity, which could kill some of the bacteria. I don't know. Do you know anything about salting? Yeah, I've never heard much about salting in your pile. Yes.
Let's go back to the brown. We have mostly oak leaves. Are they too acidic, or are they all right?
You want to balance them out because they do have a high acidity ratio. So if you, I wouldn't compost all of those and that be your only source of sort of brown material. Definitely mix it up because they do have a high acidity value.
So for anyone who didn't hear that, oak leaves are something you might want to keep an eye on how much you add to your pile because they do have a little bit of a naturally higher acidity.
So what are some things above pet waste that we don't want to compost?
Cheese.
Meat products.
Cheese,
Bone. Anything to do with meat or fat.
meat or fat. Do you want to write this down?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question. If you're striving to be organic in terms of the animal manures, do you have to worry about dairy cow manures having antibiotics and hormones and things, or is that gone?
That's a
when
great
the
question.
waste is-
I don't know that much about organic composting as far as it being certified organic compost. Does anyone in this room have any sort of thoughts on organic compost with horse manure? Or, I'm sorry, dairy cows?
So if you're composting and you just don't use any animal manures, you're going to be okay in terms of nutrient value?
Like, to get a technical organic compost pile, I would think you would need all organic compost materials. So you need organic food waste and things like that. But as far as just avoiding bad chemicals, I mean, it's all where you want to draw your line. I know one thing is if you're getting like horse manure, I've heard that people sometimes want to look in to make sure that there's not hormones being injected into the horses because that could go in the manure. That's the same thing with some large dairy farms. They might have hormones going into their cows. So.
Or
But
antibiotics.
will you have successful
Yep.
composting without manures?
Yep.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yep.
You just have to make sure you have your nitrogens and your
Great.
carbon heavies.
In the back?
Yeah, the certified organic rule on composting is they regulate fresh manure, so you can apply fresh manure 3 months or 6 months before a cash crop, depending on which type it is. And if it's a compost, you have to measure the temperature and document that over time. And if you don't, then you have to consider it a fresh manure, and then you're limited. It's 3 months before a crop that touches the soil, like potatoes, and it's 6 months before one that doesn't touch the soil, like tomatoes, if you're doing steak.
Oh, well. Thank you. What about other things not to compost?
Bones?
Bones. Why not bones?
You don't break down?
They break down very slowly, and they might attract rodents.
Your neighbor's dog.
Neighbor's dog might get in your compost.
That'll help aerate the pile.
A means to an end.
Yeah.
When you say oils, can it be something that you've cooked that's oily? Like you cook stir fry and you have it went rotten?
Yeah, I would definitely limit that because the oils, what it does is it sort of coats the material and it makes it more difficult to break down. And so I would limit your oils from going into your compost, even if it's on sort of your stir fry or something like that. But again, if you're able to balance that out with other brown materials and maybe put more surface area onto it and not add so much of that, it may be able to compost just fine.
And I think it all goes along with what is your goal in composting. If you're looking to reduce your waste, reaching the stream that goes to the landfills, you can do that, and it might slow down your process, but it's one way you can sustainably dispose of your waste.
Some other things that are pretty obvious that you don't want to throw into your compost bin are like household hazardous wastes. I want to make sure that these get out there so that people know that you can't throw in sort of your your chemicals or your different pesticides or petroleum products that will contaminate your compost system. Diseased plants, weeds that have gone to seeds, and invasive plants we don't want to put in.
Dairy,
yeah, we didn't put dairy on there. And what about peanut butter?
No.
No peanut butter?
Says right there, do not compost peanut butter.
Oh, look at that. Do not compost peanut butter.
So what's the why behind dairy and peanut butter?
Just the oil content in it. The fat.
Yeah, there's oils. Oils are a couple different things. It reduces the breakdown process, and it also attracts animals. So it's a good idea just to eliminate those from your compost system.
If you have things like crackers that have gone stale and cereal, boxed cereal and that sort of thing, can you put that in?
Oh, absolutely. Sure.
Yeah.
If you're willing to put it in your body, I think.
Did you say banana skins are okay?
Banana skins, yep.
Is that brown?
That would probably be in the greens.
Are there any foods that are so heavily with pesticides that you don't want to put the peels in?
Like oranges, I'm thinking,
Oh,
or
yeah.
even grapefruits, they're just so loaded with stuff on their skin.
Yeah.
It's like, well, if you put it into your body, I guess it's
But you
okay
don't
to be
eat
in your
the- but you don't eat
composting
the
pile.
peel.
Yeah.
You don't eat the skin.
What I do with mine is I compost mine, but I balance it out with other materials. And I go by seasonal, so I'll buy more seasonal fruits and vegetables. So in the summer times, I'm not eating so much of the oranges and the bananas, and so and those get broken down, the ones that I eat in the wintertime. So they do get broken down. I don't have a problem with those things in my compost. Again, I'd rather them go into the soil than into the landfill. Yeah.
Oh, pasta and breads.
Pasta and breads, yeah, those are compostable.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
I have a Vitamix. It's a really strong blender. Would it be a good idea to put things in the blender and then, like, I can put whole carrots in and it doesn't break. It's not like a
Yep.
regular one. Would it be a good idea to do that and then put it in?
That's just something that helps speed up the process. You're opening up more surface area, so it can only make things quicker, I would think.
Okay.
So now, what do you, oh, yeah, question.
Not compost, vegetable items, eggshells.
Eggshells.
And salts and tree limbs.
Okay, so eggshells you can put in there. They break down very slowly. They sort of act as an aerator because they break down slowly. They have some film in there that you can rinse out if you want to be completely rodent-proof. Tree limbs, things like that, you can cut those up or put some slices in there to really get the organisms in there and expose that surface area. And salts, again, I'm not sure about the balance. Salts might create some sort of unbalanced system. I would limit the salts. Yes?
If you to avoid all of those things, what's the likelihood that black bears would be attracted to the compost now that there are more of them in this area?
That's a great question. I think it depends on where you're living and the type of black bear, because I've been in places where the black bears will come in and destroy your compost just because they know that they're so used to going there, and that's where they think the food is, that they're still going to associate that as some sort of food source. So it really depends. The idea is that if you don't put in these things, it's not going to immediately draw the animals. If you have something that's drawing bears, things like that, if you have a potential for bears, maybe you could look at doing a more quicker method of composting. There's turning compost bins, and that helps break the process down because you're getting more oxygen in there, you're spinning that material and so it's breaking down faster. So that might be one option.
Another option would be moving indoors. Like this vermicomposter we have is just in our basement of our office, and there's a little bit more of a finickiness to it. We have information on vermicomposting if you want to look into that, but it can happen right in your own home.
So vermicomposting is with red wigglers. You can pick up about a pound, which is about 1,000 worms, and they'll help break down your materials. This is good if you have an apartment or if you have a basement. You can just put some newspaper in there, feed it, and these worms will just break it down and make it much more. It's already breaking down up here, but with this system, and there's some systems that are for sale here, there's actual layers, and the bottom layer is what is catching all that good compost. So that's just another system.
Where do you get the red wigglers?
There's a couple places in Massachusetts actually that sells red wigglers, and we have some paper on that if you'd like to know. But they're about, I think they're about.
Oh, okay. Which farmer's market? The Greenfield Farmer's Market. The woman who shows up who was selling them last year.
Oh, nice. So those are local. Yeah.
Can you hold compost too long when it starts to lose its magic?
Can you hold compost too long? The idea with compost is that there's organisms in there, just like your soil. So you can freeze it usually, you can hold on to it for a while, and those organisms are going to keep living in there and devouring and decomposing that material. If that should ever run out, there might be less material there, but I feel like it's still going to be, other things might feed on that. So I would say to use it within a couple years. I wouldn't keep freezing it year after year after year, but if it's frozen once, try to use it in the spring or summer just to keep those organisms alive and healthy.
How close to the house should you keep it? Because we could have, some winters have 3 feet of snow, and you may want to keep it like on the side of the garage, but is that dangerous because of the heat that builds up? Or?
Sure. Okay, so the question was, how close to your house do you want to keep your compost? And it's really up to you, I feel like. If you feel like you're fit enough to travel 100 yards to drop it in the end of your field and turn it every month, that's great. Otherwise, if you can keep it relatively close, that's fine. Again, the idea of what not to compost is to limit the amount of animals that are coming in there. And if it gets too warm, say that it's on the south side, and it's black, if it gets too warm, it's going to kill some of those organisms. So you just want to keep stirring it up and keep watching.
And we'll get into a lot more about site considerations a little bit in our presentation, so we should address any questions there.
Let's move on with like a ratio. We're looking at ratios of greens and browns.
So we had mentioned that kind of before. But when you're trying to make your balance in your pile, the best ratio as a kind of rule of thumb to go with is 3 parts browns, 1 part green. And that gives you about the right mix that you want of nitrogen and carbon to make your pile go fast, but not have too much nitrogen where it might become too hot or build a smell. So,
yeah, follow your nose. If it's kind of stinky, chances are it's becoming anaerobic, and that smell is methane that you might be smelling. So then you need to add some brown materials. And if it's not composting quick enough, add a little bit more green material, and that will speed things up.
And it's really just based off of what materials you have in front of you to try and see if you can get to that best optimum ratio of decomposition.
So, with the ratio, what we try to do is pile up your compost. If you're able to get it in somewhat of a structure, this provides a core temperature where it gets warmer in the middle versus if it was just spread out. So that's going to really speed up the process, and you can layer your materials. So you can have some green materials, some brown materials, You can throw in a scoop of soil, add some more brown materials, add some green materials, and you can layer it. You can also stir it up quite a bit if you'd like. And there's some tools that you could use, like a pitchfork. There's actually compost tools out there that you can push down into your pile, so it will go down in there, and then these forks spread out once you pull up. So it just is a healthy way to aerate your soil. The more air that's in your compost, the faster the compost is going to be. Yes?
Don't you find that seasonal is going to make a lot of difference? Because in the summer, you're not going to have your brown waste. Then in the fall, you're going to get brown, but you're not going to have the green.
Yep.
So how do you
So
get the
it's good to
percentage?
look at your compost pile like on a yearly scale. Like for me, looking at what my compost pile is, right now I have baby chickens in my house, so I have a ton of sawdust with their manure in it, so that's a great brown material to be adding. Then I also have wood ash from my wood stove, so that's a high nitrogen to get that kind of balance. So come spring, I'll have maybe grass clippings, which is another high nitrogen I'm putting in there. But in the fall, I'll have more brown materials with fall leaves.
Yeah, but in summer, you don't have any brown to put into it.
So one thing you could do to kind of hold you over until you get that balance is stockpile those materials. Do you have anything else?
Yep. If you have a pile of leaves, say in the fall, those will break down over winter, and so they'll be much more quick to compost in the spring and summer.
I have leaves all year. If you want some, you can come to my house and get them.
That's a good point.
Can you use cardboard as a
Absolutely.
brown for the winter?
Yep.
I mean, for the summer. Yeah.
So the question was, can you use cardboard? And again, there might be some inks or some different materials or chemicals in that cardboard, so use it with discretion, but you can use that as a brown material.
And you're also going to want to tear it up and shred it as much as you can to speed up the process.
Cereal box?
Yep.
That would be good.
Yeah. A lot of boxes will say printed with 100% soy ink or bio ink.
You're going to want a
Is there
water-based
symbol that they
soy
put in
ink.
a symbol like they do on the plastic?
I think every company has a different symbol.
It's not super uniform.
Yeah, okay.
Like, for instance, the little Subway wrappers they give you, on there it says compostable soy-based ink. So those are fine to throw into your pile if you're not looking for a very strictly organic sort of pile.
Yeah.
In terms of moisture, do you have to be on the schedule with that, or if you know it's going to rain, you just take the cover off and let the rain get in there and give it a stir, or should it be a more regular, giving it moisture? It gets a lot from the table scraps, doesn't it? Or?
Yep.
Yeah, so it's just important to monitor the moisture in there to make sure it's not getting too dry. And then if it's exposed to the sun, for instance, it might be good to be in the shade so it doesn't dry out as much, or adding a cover over it to kind of hold in that moisture so it can't evaporate out.
But you don't have to soak it with the hose once a week or something.
If your pile dries out very quickly, you might want to, but no, that's not necessary, as long as it's keep maintaining that moisture.
Give it the squeeze test.
Yes, that's right.
It's not bad to get your hands dirty, It's nice.
Yeah.
You wouldn't put magazines in the compost, would you, though, because of the icky
No.
thing?
No.
Color.
Those processed papers, again, they'll have some chemicals in there that I wouldn't recommend putting it in your compost. So what about... Oh.
For the what not to put in, a lot of people forget cigarettes or tobacco products.
Add it on there.
Under household hazardous waste, though.
Yeah.
They think it's biodegradable, but it's not.
Yeah, foam does not degrade. The little cigarette butts.
It takes them 5 years to degrade.
Really? Huh.
And it's also, what about what they call commercially compost piles too? Something throwing set up for commercial compost, because if your home compost is not yet hot enough or something along those lines.
Commercial piles are generally like a good way to just kind of take that stuff out of the waste stream from getting into a landfill. So it's more of like on the scale of like restaurants, universities, things like that have a lot of organic waste to deal with at once.
Yeah, and CET, Center for Ecotechnology, actually works with a couple grocery stores in the area, and will help promote and just the process of composting, but they really see a difference in what they're spending on waste. And what happens on a larger scale of composting, you might see at farms these huge piles of black dirt, and those are called windrows, and those are mechanically turned by a tractor every week or so, and that's just a way to keep that aeration going. But they'll be in a long line of your food waste, your nitrogen, and your carbons, and it will just be turned up every so often by a mechanical tiller. But those are usually long lines, high piles, but they can do that because more oxygen is hitting the surface.
And if you go by them in winter, you can even see steam coming off them a lot of the times from the heat that they're generating.
So how about turning a backyard compost? Do you have to do that?
The idea about turning backyard compost, you don't need to do that necessarily because it will happen eventually.
And some systems have aeration involved, like already in their setup, so it depends on what composting unit you're using. If you just have a pile, though, you can use tools like this to add the air. Like we were saying before, like any living thing, your composting pile kind of needs to breathe. It needs that oxygen so it can have the aerobic decomposition. So it's important to get oxygen in there. And one thing that can happen if you don't aerate your pile enough, it'll start churning to that anaerobic decomposition that happens in the landfill, for say, that makes methane, which creates a smell in your pile.
What do you call that tool?
Just an aerator?
I think they have
There's
some
on
for sale
store
over
there.
here. Yeah, it's just a compost aerator fork. Methane's flammable, so some landfills might have a methane source, collection source that generates fuel from the methane.
Or you'll see it burning off, a
Yep.
big flame.
Yep. Okay, so what about where we want to have your compost bin? What are some sort of site considerations that we want to talk about?
Next to the garden.
We could have it next to the garden for convenience. Yep.
Close to the kitchen.
Yep.
Close to the kitchen.
Convenience on the other side.
A place that doesn't get full sun.
Okay.
With the black, because of the black material.
Yep, so that's one way to avoid desiccation, losing too much water.
You want to keep it away from wetlands or wet areas, just because you don't want all that moisture in your system.
Another problem we've heard where people actually put it under a tree to avoid that desiccation from the sun, and the tree came up and started stealing their compost. So if you're looking to keep all of your compost, you might want to be careful about that.
Yeah. And then also, if you have close neighbors, you might want to think about having a contained system.
Yep, from the back.
I think my question is related to what you just said. So I have an area in the back of the yard where there are trees, but they're mostly scrub trees like cherries and things that have grown up. And I've been growing things back there for years, and then over a year, the next year I'll start digging it. If I don't have a bottom to it, it doesn't have any sides, I flip it every once in a while. I usually wait for a year. Is it leaching? Am I losing all the nutrition that might have been in that compost? If it looks, I sort of go by what it looks like.
I would think it would be fine. I think it would be fine.
Okay.
It should hold on to most of its nutrients.
You want to make sure that it's draining properly, so you don't want to put it in the middle of a ditch, say, or a culvert system. But those nutrients that are in your compost or where you're throwing that out, it's going to stay relatively in that area.
And you don't want a system where the bottom's closed off and there's additional water coming in, because you might end up with water pooling, and then you're going to get that anaerobic decomposition that results in the methane again.
So this is better.
Yeah, it's better to have it open so the water can drain out, I would think.
I have one of those earth machines that are kind of smaller. They're contained, but they have a screwy top, and the heat that's generated from inside will melt the snow that's on top, and then at night it will freeze, and so that lid becomes really difficult to to unscrew and pull the cap off. So some labor-intensive issues there.
I was thinking about putting it in my cellar because I live in Springfield and the neighbors are right on top of each other.
Okay.
And but is it dangerous? When you talked about the odor is methane is flammable. I mean.
Well, if you do it correctly with the
That's why I'm asking.
well, the leaves, the carbon will really knock down the smell.
Okay.
And it will put in more carbon source, and it will break up that anaerobic system. So the anaerobic means that there's no oxygen in there, and that's what's stinky. That's what's producing the methane. So once you balance it out with some carbon, you introduce some air, either by sort of tilling it or turning it in some way, or just having a passive system like this. It's going to bring in that air, and it shouldn't smell. If it, the smell test, do the smell test. If it's pretty stinky, then add some more carbon.
And how often do you turn those?
The question is, how often do I turn these? It really depends. I get out to my compost bin maybe like once a week, and I'll turn it, and whatever. If it's a system like this, I'll put my pitchfork in there and turn it once a week is good. In the winter time, you might have to do it more so that it doesn't freeze and clump up. All right, does anyone want to handle my food wastes? Nobody? All right, so pop quiz. What is this? Is this brown or green material?
Brown.
Brown. Acing it so far. What is this material? Brown. What is, not the plastic, but this stuff? Greens. Very good. So what is, if my system is like this, what is sort of the one thing that I should add first?
Does it matter if you're composting?
It doesn't really matter. No. But a good idea to get organisms in there is to add a scoop or two of soil. But definitely it doesn't matter too much as far as what you want to add. So I have some brown materials here.
Don't add that.
Yeah. So what I want to do is sort of layer it out, add some browns. I want to keep it somewhat contained because that's going to keep that heat source in the middle, versus if it was spread out, that there wouldn't generate that much heat in the middle. So I can add some of my compost. Things like stickers, they don't break down very quickly, so you want to remove those.
And that's something else that might have some chemicals that you might not want in your pie. So it's good to remove them as general rule of thumb.
Again, with eggshells, you can rinse those out. You can break them up a little bit more. That's going to add more of that surface area, make it a lot faster to break down. Things like avocado shells, you can tear those up more if you'd like. Same with banana peels. Just make the process quicker. I like to limit how much oranges and peels go into my compost. This time of year I'm adding quite a bit, but I just want to make sure that in the summer or in the spring that I balance it out with other green materials. But I tear those up, add some more brown material, sort of get a nice layer going. If you're, like I said earlier, if you're doing a lot of straw, hay, horse bedding or animal bedding, make sure you use a mask because you can get sick by the dust and the materials and the microbes that are in that straw or hay. So you've got that layer there. If that was any higher, you might want to add a little bit of soil to that just to bring more microorganisms in there. Add some more of that juicy coffee mix. If you you have kids, it's a great chore for kids. You know, you can call them the compost wizard or the alchemist and fuel their fire of getting in there and getting outside and talking about the process, because it's really kind of an entertaining, simple act. So we've got some greens. Now we want to pile that on as much as we can, and you've got a nice, simple little compost system. You've got a level of browns, you've got a level of greens, browns, greens. Throw in some soil in there, some compost where those organisms already are. I'm going to try something.
Look at this system.
So you have it in there, right? Let's see if we can do this. Just kind of stir it up. And what you're doing there is you're actively adding that oxygen into the mix. So even more oxygen than what it's going to get whenever you add or tumble or stir it up. You're adding that active oxygen.
So this system will be on sale for $10.
I might even put my signature on it.
Eric Brown signature products.
So does anyone have any other questions? Because that's sort of the end of our compost.
If you did this in the basement, do you have to leave it uncovered or covered?
That's a great question. The idea to keep it covered is it helps keep that heat in your system.
The cat's out of it.
Yep. It keeps cats out of it, and hopefully your mice out of it too. So it will just help break that material down faster. But it's not required. You can have an open-aired system. Yeah.
Majority of what goes into my compost pile seems to be grass clippings, because we have a large yard with grass. But should I just be saving up my leaves during the fall and putting more leaves in? Because most of it is grass clippings, which I think is green.
Yep.
Instead of having all this green stuff going.
Yep, that's a great idea. Is you can stockpile some of your yard waste and use it over the years or over the year when you need to balance out sort of the browns or the greens. You can have those leaves, or you can have that green, the grass clippings to add whenever you need to add the that balance out system.
Yeah, grass clippings. When don't you put grass clippings in? Do you have weed control on your own?
Yeah, you're definitely not going to want to put your grass clippings from a treated lawn into your pile, just because of those chemicals that come from the treatments.
So no treated lawns, clippings don't go in.
Yeah, because what's eventually going to happen is those chemicals that are on your lawn is going to leach into the compost, and eventually it's going to be broken down depending on who you talk to or depending on who you are, what you believe, but it will eventually get broken down. But then you're going to be, if it's a vegetable garden, you're going to be consuming those things. So what we think about is trying to do things naturally. We actually have integrated pest management workshop that's coming up, and it talks a little bit more about that. But you want to stay away from adding those sort of byproducts of chemicals into your compost system, because you never know.
What's not compost starter products inside the store? Positive, negative? What do you think on those?
They're unnecessary. They could speed up the process potentially. I know there's like the compost bricks, which are like coconut husk kind of material, and all that is just adding carbon. So I guess people would want to get those. If they only have food waste, they might want to get one of those bricks to bring back the balance of carbon and nitrogen.
And they probably sell those because there's a lot of nutrients already in there.
Yeah.
And so if you are interested in balancing out, say, your pH of your soil, and you find that like lobster compost might have a higher acidity, you might be able to use some of that compost in your bin or in your system, and that will sort of balance out what you need to add into your lawn or your garden.
Now, in an open bin, this time of year, everything's going to freeze, right? If you throw your orange peels and lemon peels and so forth.
So it's all about the temperature of your pile and how quick it's happening. In
So
winter,
if you throw it on the top, it's going to freeze, right?
yes.
Yeah, but if you keep stirring it up, or if you're able to put it in a black container, or if you're able to put it in the sun, a lot of people they just don't compost in the wintertime, which is unfortunate, but you can just put it in there and eventually it's going to thaw
it's
out.
not going to run away on you.
And it takes a little bit more muscle to get it going. But.
And I mean, this is a little miniature furnace here.
Yeah.
Inside of it, once the composting and things start to break down, it's going to make its own heat. So if you have a 3x3 pile, it's still going to be very active at the center there. So year round, it should be.
I hope there are no stupid composting questions.
Oh, no,
I'm about to ask one. Last year in my bin, I had a bunch of what I thought were the red worms. Will they just naturally find their way to your bin, or are those the wrong kind of worms?
Nope. I mean, all worms are invasive here because the glaciers came down and killed the native species. So there are worms present, though.
I shouldn't worry about
they're just volunteers. They're helping you out.
Yep, worms are part of the system.
I figured it was a good thing.
You want to look out if you do have a vermiculture bin going. You want to make sure that you're not adding insects or animals that are going to prey on those worms. The centipedes, the red centipedes that move around really quickly, love red wigglers.
That's what they eat.
Yeah. So if this was your vermicomposting bin and you pull up the system and you see like a red, fast-moving insect, they're attracted to leaves, or they get put in there by leaves. So you might want to reduce the amount of leaves that are going into the bin. But try to get rid of those little red centipedes. Millipedes are fine. The black millipedes are fine. They move slower. The red centipedes move very quickly, and they'll eat your red wigglers. Great question. Great.
Yeah. If you've never composted before, how do you get that compost that you need to put in to start your compost?
Well, a good substitute for that would just be the soil of your lawn. As long as it hasn't been treated with chemicals, it should have all the organisms already there.
Yep. And then garden centers like this sell a lot of topsoil or nutrient-rich compost that you can use to start out your compost bin or to...
Well, if you have a lot of house plants, should you just buy a big bag of that and then use it for this and then use it for your home purpose as well?
Sure.
Yeah. If you need compost now, that's one solution.
In a black circular tumbler, is there a danger of filling it too high and too much? I mean, what is the ratio that way?
It's just your ability. It becomes a little bit more labor intensive to sort of turn those once they get high. So what happens is this compost will break down about 75%. So you'll have a little bit of compost from a lot of material. So what you can do is once that bin gets too heavy to sort of rotate or to get in there with a pitchfork to twirl it up, add to another pile or take some of this out, put it on your garden, and start making some new compost with your kitchen scraps.
You really do need two piles, though, don't you? I guess the part that confuses me is that if you kept adding stuff to the same bin, well, some of it's not going to break down, and you don't want, right? So I guess that part I don't quite get. I mean, you really have to have a separate space.
So if your priority in composting is to get a nice, clean, pure end compost product, you might want to take a system approach that will separate that compost product out in itself. Like the vermicomposter we have inside, at the top you put in the fresh materials and it filters through with little mesh holes and the compost drops to the bottom. So at the bottom there's just compost. So it's all in the system you have. And you can do the 3 compost bin approach where you put fresh stuff in this one, and then when it gets to a certain critical mass, you leave it and move to the next bin. So in the end, this will be pure compost, and this will just be all the fresh materials at the third one.
And it's okay if the materials aren't completely broken down.
Oh, okay.
You might, I mean, I think there's a corn cob in here from like last summer, and you know, there's pieces of leaves that haven't been broken down completely.
We're still working on getting rid of that.
So don't be scared if there's some compost that might not be completely broken down. You can still use that. The sun is coming out. This is great. Let's go garden. Thank you so much, people.